Again, welcome. You should see a poll question there if you're just joining us. We're going to give it one more minute for folks to jump in to this live before we kickstart with the presentation. Thank you for being on time. Alrighty, Jacob, let's go ahead and end the poll, share the results so people can see who else is joining us today. Really appreciate y'all taking time around your lunch hour to join this conversation today. Um, this is, as a reminder, part one of a two-part virtual workshop series that we are doing with our partnership with the Center for Creative Land Recycling. Obviously, today is Brightfields 101. Our next workshop coming up will be on August 13th. Many of you may have already registered for that. We'll provide the registration link again if you haven't. Um, and it is not PM Pacific time as I note this. It is actually AM. Don't worry. That is a typo. So you won't have to join late at night. That one will be much more focused on how Brightfields can support affordable energy planning. We will get into financials a little bit more specifically there. So today will be more of an intro to the topic with a little bit of the context, followed by a next one where we build on this directly. It will not be a repeat. It will be a very cumulative session. And then the last 30 minutes of each webinar, including today, will be in office hours with our team and with the Center for Creative Land Recycling. That's Claire and her team. So feel free to come with any site or community specific questions, and we are happy to dig in there. Our team here is split actually between two organizations, and we'll explain the two organizations there. You're joined today from myself, Jacob, Lola on our team, and then Claire Weston from our partner at the Center for Creative Land Recycling. Really appreciate that partnership and looking forward to jumping in. Um, Rocky Mountain Institute, or RMI, if you're not familiar with us, we are an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to a clean, prosperous energy future for all. We work with a whole range of stakeholders, and we have been doing that since 1982. We work predominantly around the US and then increasingly in over 60 other countries on a whole range of different whole systems thinking, unconventional partnerships, and with communities on the ground in technical assistance roles to help advance sustainable, reliable, and affordable energy systems. We also try to practice what we preach. So we do have two photos of two of our offices in the US. Both of these happen to be in Colorado, where our headquarters is, in Boulder and Basalt, respectively, where we have net zero energy buildings designed from an efficiency standpoint and a whole host of other passive design considerations. We are thrilled to partner with the Center for Creative Land Recycling, and so I will turn it over to Claire to briefly introduce the tabs and see Claire's role.
Thanks, Matthew. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Claire Weston. I'm the program director at the Center for Creative Land Recycling. For those of you who are a little maybe unfamiliar with us, Center for Creative Land Recycling is a 25-year-old, actually more at this point, nonprofit, and we serve land reuse practitioners and communities endeavoring along the land reuse process all over the country, but for the purpose of this webinar and then for the purpose of our relationship with RMI, we focus primarily on regions 9 and 10. We are what is called a technical assistance to brownfields provider, or TAB provider. And in that capacity, we provide technical assistance to communities at every point along the land reuse and brownfield redevelopment process. So starting with maybe a brownfield inventory and prioritization, all the way to maybe attracting a developer. We can kind of jump in and help you at any point. I think we have a couple services if you just want to go, yep, there we go. So we can really support you at any point. We pride ourselves on meeting communities where they are in the process. So it's been great working with RMI and excited for this webinar. Thanks, Matthew.
Thanks, Claire. And I'll just note, if you are outside of EPA regions 9 or 10, don't fret. One, you're still welcome here. And two, we also do provide technical assistance in a similar capacity through our partnership with Kansas State University. That's EPA's region 5 through 8. So really, if you are somewhere between Ohio and Hawaii, we can help you out probably in some different ways. So feel free to reach out. But today we'll be focusing on, given this partnership with CCLR, predominantly EPA regions 9 and 10. Some of the more focused examples will be there as well. So just know that we're focused there, but not exclusive or exhaustive. When we talk about the partnership, really, CCLR and RMI are able to provide free and tailored technical assistance to help communities across EPA regions 9 and 10 to responsibly plan for and deploy clean energy on brownfields and closed landfills. Our core goals are to educate communities and site owners about brownfields reuse options that include clean energy. Welcome. This is one of those core moments for that. Uh, Additionally, we can go deeper and provide pre-development site evaluation and analysis to communities considering Brightfields. And we can also provide other technical assistance and tools to help with reuse planning, funding, financing, clean energy procurement, utility engagement, the list goes on. So if there's something that's not explicitly listed here, don't worry. Please don't hesitate to reach out, and we will be honest with you about what we can and can't do. Um, as well, it's also worth noting at this moment that RMI is a nonprofit. We are not a developer. We are not selling you any services today. We don't do that. We don't develop or build projects. We work in kind of that gray space between site owners and the people who are going to, the people and firms who might build the projects. So we're here to help bridge those gaps and help you make better decisions as site owners. So our objectives for this workshop series are one, to educate communities about the continued opportunities to reuse brownfields and close landfills for hosting clean energy projects. And number two, to help site owners and municipalities more deeply understand how Brightfield projects can offer opportunities for more affordable energy and support long-term budget planning. For today specifically, my hope is that by the end of this workshop, everyone here, whether this is the first time you're hearing the term or you've heard this before, um, will understand what Brightfields are, why communities and site owners might consider Brightfields, and how to advance a Brightfield project where appropriate for your community. And if you're with a nonprofit or if you're with a state agency, that's fine. We always want to make sure that other folks understand kind of what site owners might be considering, what the market might be able to handle right now, and the role that states and other organizations have in supporting and facilitating these projects. To do this most effectively, we do have a few ground rules for today. In particular, we ask that everyone be present. We appreciate you joining and encourage you to close the apps that might alert you to things, whether it's Teams or email or Outlook. Um, Pretend like we're in person here. We're going to do our best to make this as interactive as possible. And so, accordingly, please be prepared for those opportunities for us to not only hear from you if you have questions via the chat or at particular moments when we take breaks for questions, but also to embrace kind of this learning environment that we have. Um, Based on the registration data that we got, this is going to be an introduction to the topics for a majority of participants. So, welcome. Again, if this is a new topic for you, this is the perfect environment for this. We also hope that people who might be have joined us before, or have seen us at various conferences or have worked with us in the past. Hopefully, you'll learn something from this conversation too. We do our best to keep the data that we use as updated as possible, and the information on the market as updated as possible as well. And last but certainly not least, not only are we not selling you anything in general, this is free technical assistance, but we ask that if you are with a private sector firm or a company, you're welcome to ask questions. We welcome you as well. But please know this is not a sales environment, and that anyone who does violate this ground rule will be removed immediately from this. I have done that before. Don't make an example out of yourself. And in terms of the interactivity of the virtual workshop, there'll be poll questions throughout. If you joined us in the first 3 minutes, you already saw a few of those. We'll have a few different types of different questions that will pop up. We also welcome your questions throughout via the chat feature in Zoom, or during scheduled Q&As. And then again, as a reminder, we have office hours at the end. So after the first hour of this, we'll stay on for another 20 or 30 minutes, and just take questions. If it's about your site, a community, a concept you didn't fully understand, um, everyone is welcome to stick around, but there's no like scheduled slide or presentation at that point. So, For today's agenda, we're going to cover the what, why, and how of Brightfields. We're going to pause for Q&A, and then we will have some office hours. Pretty straightforward agenda. Let's dive in. So, what are Brightfields? Well, I could tell you, or I could ask you first. Jacob, let's launch this poll question and see engage folks' understanding of Brightfields and Brownfields at the beginning. So you should see a poll question pop up asking how familiar are you with brownfields and how familiar are you with Brightfields? Recognizing that those are two very different spaces and that people might have different experience in each. Great, I'll leave this up for about 5 more seconds. This just helps us understand who is in the room and helps you understand who's in the room. All right, Jacob, let's go ahead and close out the poll question and share the results with everyone. What's I think exciting here from my perspective is that we have a bunch of folks, probably three-quarters of you all, have professional experience working with brownfields, which is great. And virtually none of you have professional experience working with Brightfields. So to those of you who answered Bright what? Well, we'll tell you. So thanks for joining us. So, to dive in more specifically, bright fields reuse previously disturbed, often contaminated land to reactivate sites and support a local energy transition. But to understand bright fields, you have to understand what brownfields are. And so, according to the EPA, kind of the standard definition, a brownfield is a property where the expansion, the redevelopment, or the reuse may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. Common brownfields will include former industrial sites, inactive landfills or dumps, old factories, closed power plants, abandoned mine lands. The list goes on. It could be as small as dry cleaners or abandoned gas station stores, um, old strip malls. There's a whole range of different possibilities in the brownfield space. Um, in the Brightfield space, simply put, Brightfield is siting renewable energy, typically solar, though not exclusively, on a former brownfield, closed landfill, or a Superfund site. So the Brightfield refers to the reuse, brownfield relates to the status of the property. Brightfields offer a huge yet largely untapped potential market. In terms of this is a map here of the Brightfields deployed in the US through 2024. So these are completed projects. In fact, you have a Brightfield that has been deployed in almost every state. There are a couple states that don't, I think it's Louisiana, Idaho, Alaska, Puerto Rico, no, Puerto Rico has them. So just a few states and territories that do not have a Brightfield. But what's important to understand is there are over 190,000 potential brownfield sites for clean energy deployment on US, according to US EPA's repowering mapper. We specifically looked at 4,300 closed or inactive landfills a few years ago and estimated that that could potentially support up to 63 gigawatts of solar power, which is roughly equivalent to the state of South Carolina's consumption if you don't live in the gigawatt space on a regular basis. And through 2024, we are working to update this number. Only 624 completed Brightfields projects totaling about 4.4 gigawatts have been deployed. So if we look at that technical potential, just 1% of the potential Brightfield sites could support approximately 6 gigawatts of clean energy and 60,000 jobs, mostly construction jobs, mostly temporary, but some operations and management jobs as well. Brightfields come in all shapes and sizes. What do they look like? Well, you have a closed landfill solar project on the left of the screen here. That's in Massachusetts. You got a wind energy project on a former industrial brownfield up in New York at the bottom. And then you have a closed landfill solar project in Washington State here in the top right of your screen. They kind of contour to the land. They take on a variety of different shapes and sizes, depending on what's available and what the options are. And so when we look at more specific types of siting, like a landfill solar project, You might be wondering, like, can we put something safely on closed landfills? Short answer is yes, if it's done well, but also if you take certain precautions as you go. So landfill solar looks like very similar to solar projects, but with a few exceptions. So typically they are ballasted either on like barrels, cement blocks, or kind of gravel pits, sorry, gravel baskets of some kind. We'll show a couple of different examples. You can see those ballasts in this example in Maryland with these cement ballasts, where the poles from the solar panels do not actually penetrate the cap of the landfill at all. They are all surface mounted. And then here, this is another example of a different landfill solar project in Maryland, actually, that's working its way around the different methane monitoring equipment, access roads, and still allows for the operations and management and monitoring of the closed landfill in itself to comply with various state and federal requirements for monitoring. So before we continue, Jacob, let's throw up the next poll question here. I want to see if you have a sense of how many Brightfields. Oh, I actually ruined the surprise on this. Put the slide in the wrong place. Well, let's see if you paid attention. How many Brightfields have been built in the US through 2024? That is my mistake. That slide was out of order. All right, Jacob, let's go ahead and share the results here. Yes, if you guessed 624, that means yes, you're right, and or you were paying attention as we started to go through this. So thank you for both of those. Um, there are more coming. We are actively working to get a sense of the updated market in the last 2 years. But at this point, what we know so far is there are over 624. What's important to know here is that that number represents the fact that Brightfield's development space, states, communities have seen that Brightfields can be built safely and responsibly. Has this been done before? Yes, we just talked about that. If you want to see actually the breakdown by different type of site, that also exists. So you can see that almost half, except in fact, more than half of the projects to date have been on landfills or landfill buffers. And that's mostly solar projects, a few wind projects on landfill buffer area. But you can also see projects that have been built on former mine lands, projects that have added battery storage on these sites, on RCRA sites. There's a whole host of these. And the most important thing when you're building on any type of brownfield or on a closed landfill is to take certain precautions to not damage the existing facilities, monitoring equipment, landfill cap, and so on. Experienced, qualified developers who work in the space should know what they're doing there, but you always want to make sure that if you're stepping into this market and trying to talk with folks, they understand these types of precautions. So let's talk about the opportunity for regions 9 and 10. Jacob, we have one more poll question here, just to see what people think here. So what two states together have more Brightfield projects than 45 other states combined? So these are the top two states for their Brightfields deployment. Which do you believe have more projects deployed so far than 45 other states combined? Again, there's a poll question up there. What two states together have more Brightfield projects deployed than 45 other states combined? Give it about 10 more seconds. Trying to optimize the time between when you see the poll and how quickly you can type your question into ChatGPT. All right, Jacob, let's go ahead and end the poll and share the results. If you guessed Massachusetts and New Jersey, you were correct. The answer may surprise folks, and we'll talk about why. Um, the tendency is probably to go to some of the larger states, but Massachusetts and New Jersey dominate this field so far. Go ahead and close that out. Um, So let's jump in here to give you a little bit more perspective on that, especially if that was surprising to you. There are 5 states that host over 60% of the US Brightfield projects to date. Massachusetts is number 1, New Jersey is number 2, New York is number 3, California is number 4, Connecticut is number 5, and the rest of the country is number 6 through 50. So that is the snapshot here of projects built to date. And you might be wondering why. Why is that the case? Well, there are two main reasons. And it's not that Massachusetts has the best sunlight of all of the states. It's definitely not that. Particularly, it's because the siting of clean energy is a land use issue at its fundamental purpose. And our energy system has always required land. And Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Connecticut here, and a few other states that are starting to jump into this fray, understand that their land is limited and they're trying to figure out, particularly smaller states with less land available, have to prioritize what they're using their land for. So Massachusetts and New Jersey were some of the early leaders in saying, this is what we want to incentivize and this is where we want to incentivize it. And so that has driven the development and the industry in multiple places. They have policies and practices that really help make it easy for the market to find these sites, as complicated as they might be, more attractive. Now, that said, we are seeing progress across the country, as you saw from that map before. While a few states initially led the Brightfields push, like Massachusetts and New Jersey, these types of projects are becoming part of the transition across America. Here's an example in Phoenix, Arizona, 10 megawatts on a 118-acre landfill in Phoenix, 2 megawatts across Pittsburgh's Hazelwood Green old steel mill rooftop. So that's directly on, it's technically a rooftop solar on an old steel mill exoskeleton on another brownfield. So it's just layers and layers of Brightfields. Then you have Martin County, Kentucky. They're building 200 megawatts of solar on a shuttered Martiki mine land. And Franklin County, Ohio, 50 megawatts of solar planned on the closed landfill there. So working its way across the country in different regions and far more examples than just these. Let me show you another one here. And this one allows me to stop talking and you to listen to someone else. This is the Purdy Landfill Solar Project in Pierce County, Washington. They're selling 1 megawatt of power back to the grid and using their closed landfill to do that.
We're at the Purdy transfer station today to look at our new solar array, which has been a project that we've been working on in Pierce County for the last 5 years. We believe that when this project is finished, we're going to create enough power here to power 100 homes in our region. So we're really excited to see not only a good use of this space, but creating more green energy for the Key Pen area.
Back in 1989 is when the landfill closed, so it's been sitting since then. Having this open space, when we were looking at what can we do to serve the community, a solar field made perfect sense to produce power, to go back into the grid and serve the community. So here with the Purdy landfill, we're working with just shy of 5 acres for the solar field. And part of our grant, we had to look at how much power we could produce with the size of the property we have, how much of this property is actually facing the sun that we can put the solar panels on before going too far over the edge. And what we came up with was about a 1 megawatt facility, or just shy of 1 megawatts that we'd be producing. Some of the unique challenges that we had to face: the cap on the landfill cannot be disturbed in any way. It has to maintain its integrity. So that's when we had the engineers design the ballast systems and hold down the solar field, instead of driving the traditional pylons down into the ground, cutting open the cap, which we would have to then repair.
We got this project funded through the Climate Commitment Act, and many of the voters in Pierce County voted to pass that, and then they voted again to repass it. So this is Climate Commitment Act dollars being spent in our area, making sure that people, their tax dollars are coming back to them. One of the things we're very excited about is getting Pierce County's environmental education group out here and bringing kids out to learn more about solar energy and the importance of it as we move forward, trying to green our energy base. The state is a major partner here, along with Penn Light, our local utility, and some community groups that have helped us think about how we do education in the future here.
So that's the Purdy landfill solar. And now we're going to move on from that. I don't need to watch that again. Great video though. Thanks, Purdy team. That's a great example though. They had reached out to us for some technical assistance back in 2024 when some of the federal requirements around tax credits were rapidly evolving, as well as just this spring for some contract and an interconnection agreement advice. So again, we don't provide legal or tax advice specifically, but we can help them navigate different funding financing considerations and help them engage strategically with their utility. And so this was an opportunity where CCLR and RMI were able to lean in and review some of the documents that were in draft form and help them just think through that based on our experience of seeing multiple versions of this in projects in other communities. So if you are in the late stages of a project, great, we can discuss where we might be able to be helpful. If you're just starting out and want to understand how do you get from concept all the way to procurement or utility negotiations and deployment, we're also happy to have conversations with you there. We talked about the 624 projects completed across the US. There are 62 completed Brightfield projects in EPA regions 9 and 10 to date. A majority of those are in California so far, but you can see quite a smattering across most of the other states in EPA regions 9 and 10. And what I think is hopefully more important for us to take away from here is not only has this been done, but there are over 18,800 different sites that have been pre-screened by the US EPA for Brightfields reuse in EPA regions 9 and 10 alone. And so you can see kind of the spread of the different types of sites and the different numbers of sites across different states. So feel free to take a look at that. Again, if you joined us a little bit late, we're focused on EPA regions 9 and 10, which is basically the West Coast plus Alaska and Hawaii today. But we do provide technical assistance for EPA regions 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, plus tribal communities as well. So I'm going to pause here and see if we have any questions that are on kind of the definitions or the numbers or the practices so far before we continue on with the presentation, before I pass it over to Jacob to talk more about the benefits and challenges of these types of sites. Lola, were there any questions that we should address now or clarify live? For those who are wondering, yes, we will. We are recording this. We will share the slides and we will share the recording with you within the next few days after this workshop. And of course, we have the second part of this where we go more into details on the financials and electricity markets on August 13th. And we'll share those materials as well after that workshop.
Matthew, I see one question in the chat.
Thank you. Oh, from Yolanda?
Yes.
Yes. Yolanda asked in the chat, are these potential sites in EPA's surplus or a variety of different properties? So in short, Yolanda, the sites that have been pre-screened cover a range of different databases from the landfill methane outreach program to the Brownfields acres database to the Superfund database. It may not be exhaustive of every type of site, and certainly some states have different classifications of contaminated sites within the state as well. We can provide we'll provide links to the repowering mapping tool as well, where you can look up exactly like what potential sites were used in the making of that database. Great. Any other questions? Feel free to come off mute if you want to just ask it live as well. Hopefully at this point you can now articulate or at least understand what Brightfields are, which was the first part of our objective, understanding what they are and what they look like. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Jacob. And Jacob, I will let you take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks, Matthew, for giving us that overview. I'm here to talk a bit more specifically about some of the benefits and challenges of Brightfields. So now that you know what they are, and where they could be, why might we want to build them and why might not we want to build them? So we're going to start off with some of the benefits here. There's a lot of benefits both locally and more regionally that communities can leverage Brightfields to deliver. First of all, it's a sustainable land reuse. There's not necessarily other uses for the site, and this gives an opportunity to use a site that, uh, might prevent a greenfield from being developed. There's existing infrastructure that may be available, as some of these brownfield and landfill sites might be in areas that are already populated, already have three-phase power lines or other power lines that may be useful to connect them, or areas where they can use power nearby, which might save some money in the long run as well as time. It creates local jobs and an opportunity for site revitalization, as the investment that's put into the site could be used to potentially beautify it or make it more appealing, as well as creating jobs for those that are doing the work, both building the fields and any potential remediation. It allows us to reinvest in the communities that are left behind in the energy transition, as brownfields and landfills can historically be in areas which might not have had as much investment in them. This is an opportunity to pay back the value that was given to their land in the industrial or landfill use that can now be converted into something more productive instead of sitting there. It can generate local revenue from innovative reuse. So this can be in terms of utility bill savings or by selling electricity to the utility. And on that same note, it allows us to hedge against the rising utility bills, as it provides some more certainty as you're investing in these panels. And we'll go over a bit more when we talk about the financials, exactly what we mean by that. But just with those broad categories, Matthew, if you wouldn't mind launching the poll, I want to get a feeling from all of you, which benefits immediately stand out as the ones you think your community would most benefit from when it comes to turning these sites into bright fields?
And as a reminder, this is a poll question. If you expand the screen a little bit, you might be able to see the full. You either need to scroll or you can expand the poll.
Yeah, there should be options A through F available. Cool. I'm gonna give it a bit more time for this one just because I'm curious to see what people have to say, and also because it's a bit more involved. No worries, Richard. I think any answer you give here would be reasonable. So I don't really think there's any answer that would say, "Oh, you want to hedge against your rising utility bill? Who's this guy?" So you're in good hands. I also can't see who answers what. All right, cool. Give it another minute and then I'll end and share it, or half a minute, I guess. Let's see, there's still people waiting to submit it. Brian, to answer your question while I'm waiting for the final polls to roll in, I believe the most prevalent green energy source in Alaska is actually still solar. It just has a bit more of a challenge, as there are certain times a year where they're not able to leverage it the same way you would year-round elsewhere in the country.
You'll note that
Uh,
the current base load in Alaska actually is hydro. Hydropower is actually the most prevalent currently used source. To Jacob's point, though, there is potential for solar. Just how that gets used and how you plan a project matters.
cool. Thanks, Matthew. All right, cool. And would you mind sharing the result of the poll questions? So it looks like there's a pretty broad spectrum of answers. It looks like the two most popular first choices are for these local jobs and site revitalization, as well as having sustainable land reuse. It seems like using existing infrastructure was a common second place option. So all of this goes to say, it seems like all of them are, but between all the communities here, it's hard to say generally what's going to be the most useful for a given community. It seems like using existing infrastructure and hedging against spill are the ones where some communities find less impactful. But of course, for some, it's their first choice. So all that to say, there's a lot of reasons to potentially build Brightfields. And there's particular reasons why we may want to use closed landfills as well. So why using closed landfills? I think some of the benefits sort of previewed this, but the site conditions are often conducive to building solar. Landfills often have good sun exposure and other characteristics that support energy installation. They're often flat and don't have much tree cover. There's limited reuse options for this applies to some brownfields as well, but especially for landfills. There's very other competing redevelopment that's available for them. As Matthew pointed out with the ballasted solar, that's one way of building on top of them without puncturing the cap. And this avoids that land use conflict with other priorities that you might have building solar elsewhere. Uh, there's sustainable land reuse. Landfill solar can repurpose these sites that's already disturbed and reduce the amount of greenfield development that might be needed. And there's the potential for revenue, as these are often in communities which can take revenue from property taxes and land leases from these otherwise inactive sites. So here's an example of a specific project and some of the benefits that it provided in Montgomery County, Maryland. Uh, so this was used specifically to support low-income Pepco customers as a host and anchor buyer, as it provided a community solar subscription program on a closed landfill. So this is a 170-acre site, which is part of a larger 545-acre site, which included a landfill that was closed in 1995. Uh, the 6 megawatt solar project has two parts, 4 megawatts of which were community solar, and two are for the county as a off-taker. Off-taker meaning that they're the energy buyer. Uh, it provides a subscription-based approach for the low-income and moderate-income Pepco customers, thanks to a state grant where they're able to reduce their bills through the energy provided by this site. And it allows that they were able to build this by leveraging regional partnerships between the county, the neighborhood, Amoresco, which is their developer, and Pepco, the utility, as well as Maryland, who provided some of the grants that were used to develop it. So as you can see, building these sites is usually a collaboration between a lot of different organizations, and the benefits they provide can also flow to those organizations. As the video mentioned, that it's bringing tax dollars back to the community is sort of the goal of an ideal site. So now, why would you might not want to build one? There's a reason why not every landfill has one. They're not without their complications, and especially compared to undeveloped and vacant land, which is why they're less common. But first off, there's assessment and cleanup costs. If a landfill is currently unknown in terms of what type of quality it is, or has cleanup that's needed, those are additional costs that are going to be needed before it's able to be built on. There are federal, state, and local regulations such as permitting, zoning, and land use that can add complexity to site requirements, as well as reviews that may have to happen as part of those assessments and cleanups. There's a timeline for remediation, which may delay the building or give more uncertainty to a developer. Most likely, any of these will need to be completed before the project begins construction if remediation is needed. There's additional liability. This can be dealt with, but there needs to be clarity on who has the liability from the site. And the developers are usually very aware of this, as they may view these sites as riskier. And grid interconnection. The interconnection costs and timelines can vary substantially between projects due to existing infrastructure. This is something that limits all solar development and all energy development, not just on landfills, but it's worth considering that this is a major barrier to a lot of energy development. None of these are insurmountable, but all these complications can add cost. So here's a bit more specific on some of those challenges. Considerations with the cap. Landfills need to be capped when they're closed. These require specific designs, these non-invasive foundations such as ballast. And if a landfill is uncapped, it will require it to be capped. There are currently companies that are able to combine capping with solar in some way. So even if it's not capped does not mean you're not able to build solar on it. It's just a consideration. Existing infrastructure and operations need to be accommodated, such as the methane that was in one of the pictures earlier, where the solar need to be built around it. And that can be true for leachate and gas collection. Settlement, the landfill might still be settling, which may impact where you're able to deploy and develop. That's why older landfills are sometimes easier to build on. There can be a lack of on-site electricity consumption. Sometimes this is a benefit, sometimes this is a drawback. If there is no on-site electricity consumption, there's going to need to be interconnection to the utility most likely, or wires being stretched elsewhere. There can be community concerns. Any project needs to consider any environmental justice and site reuse concerns, including educating residents and stakeholder groups about what the design and regulations could be. And then finally, as the example earlier pointed out, there's a lot of interdepartmental coordination that's going to be required when it comes to both reuse, revitalization, and building these new solar arrays. There's not going to be one single overseer. So yeah, any questions?
Jacob, while people are thinking, why don't we go ahead? I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll
Yeah.
question. We'll have one more opportunity for Q&A, and then of course the office hours at the end. So let me go ahead and throw up one more question for y'all. Should now see this little pulse check. Just wanted to get a temperature read for those who are still with us. How are you feeling after learning the basics? There's no wrong answer. You will only partially offend us.
I think can safely close the poll and share it. Seems like most people are intrigued but need to learn more, which makes a lot of sense since we're throwing a lot of information at you. Some people excited, some people unsure, all of which are very reasonable responses. So I think since people wanted to learn more, Matthew, if you want to take over and share some of the economics of Brightfields, I think that might help answer some of the questions.
Happy to. Um, Thanks, Jacob. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we're gonna part two of this workshop series, once you learn the what, why, and how of Brightfields, is gonna be really digging into the affordability and the economics and the financials related to Brightfields and clean energy projects in general, especially given the lack of familiarity that many of you indicated that you had with how energy projects are funded and financed. But I want to give you a preview on that. And to do that, of course, we're going to launch a poll question first to gauge your understanding of Brightfield's economics first. So here you should have three questions actually. Like number one is like many local infrastructure projects, Brightfield projects need grants to be financially feasible. True, false, or you genuinely have no idea. Question two is aside from the COVID years, 2020 to 2022, electricity prices declined slightly on average in the US since 2000. True, false, or you honestly have no idea. And then question three is how familiar are you with the federal incentives available for Brightfield projects? And we list a few, and again, there's no wrong answer. We just want to gauge a sense of the level of familiarity there. Three questions there, should be right up in your screen. We're gonna go ahead and end this. There were right answers for the first two. Um, so for question number one, the right answer is false. Um, Brightfield projects do not need grants to be financially feasible. We know of multiple projects that have not required grants. Sometimes they do help, and we have certainly cited some examples where grants came in handy, including the Purdy landfill in the video. So it really depends on the economic situation and the price of electricity and the market that you're in and the type of site and the size of the site. Question two, since aside from the COVID years, electricity prices declined slightly. That is false. Most of you got that correct. Prices have continued to go up. And we'll show a graph of that in a moment. And thank you for sharing the familiarity. All of these have been used to contribute to some of these projects. Not all of them are as available now as they used to be. We'll talk more about that next time. So I'm going to close that out. Now, so despite additional site preparation and design related costs, some of those challenges that Jacob talked about, um, key Brightfield benefits can actually help reduce overall project costs. So the first one is that you're reactivating a site that otherwise lacked viable reuse options, which can stimulate new tax revenue. So we're thinking about the life cycle costs of the project here. Co-locating with existing operational costs can actually help bring down the costs because you're covering multiple things. For a regular solar array, you would have to mow some grass, make sure that there's not vegetation that's blocking the production of the panels. You'd have to do that anyway on a closed landfill and on other types of mine land sites and other things to manage some wildlife. I actually ran a net present value analysis for the impacts of wild hog management damage to a community to assess the costs that they were spending each year on that. And a fence that would come with the solar panels would actually help mitigate that. And then there are other blight related issues that can either impact property values or impact local tax collection and revenue beyond just this project. When you're located near existing infrastructure, roads, poles, wires, additional infrastructure there, some of the redevelopment costs can actually be lowered compared to undeveloped land, depending on the proximity to the infrastructure and the quality of it. Siting on closed landfills, former mine lands, or brownfields often prompts much less, if any, community opposition from the examples that we're familiar with. And when you're trying to develop energy infrastructure projects or a lot of, industrial projects in general, those costs and the engagement with the community can add up. And last but not least, it's worth noting that there's a very different market for potentially disturbed or potentially contaminated land. Let's just say there's not a bidding war usually for the surface of a landfill in the same way there might be for a flat piece of land somewhere else that has no prior use. The other important thing to note, and this gets to the electricity price discussion, is fixed cost energy projects hedge against, they protect against rising electricity and volatile fuel prices. And this is what to examine when understanding the longer term return on investment for a project. Typically, we look at a 25 to 30-year lifespan of a project for the typical solar project. Wind has a slightly different lifespan as well. And so you're looking at like what is that 20 to 25 to 30-year cost of electricity that you are hedging against. The reason it hedges is because it's a fixed cost of energy. There's no fuel that goes into this. So electricity prices in the US have increased by over 26% in the last 5 years. Because solar offers that fixed cost, wind does well as well, so does hydro. You just aren't building hydropower plants on a closed landfill. Because solar offers fixed cost energy prices, savings can increase as the prices increase, actually. So imagine briefly if your community added solar in 2010. Again, this is the US average, so this is not looking at a specific state or a specific community here, but imagine if your community had solar in 2010 at that price of approximately 12 cents per kilowatt hour. Where would you be now? Short answer is that whole area under the curve and or under the line there and above the flat line is all savings that you're generating relative to what you would have had. So we'll look more closely at some more state-specific situations in our next workshop and go into more detail on like what's the opportunity in what states based on the electricity prices and the market that you have. But wanted to tee up how to think about that as we approach it. So our hope is that by understanding what's possible, communities and site owners can include Brightfields as part of your community revitalization or reuse planning or tax-based incentivizing strategy because there are hundreds of thousands of brownfields available. The The technical potential is significant, and there are a whole range of different incentives and electricity markets that shape what is ultimately financially attractive. So with that, Jacob, I'll pass it to you to just briefly walk through the technical assistance, and then we'll take our final break for questions and then shift over to office hours.
Great. And as a reminder, we're going to be sharing the slides and recording after. So these are some text dense slides. So don't worry if you don't get everything, as I'm not going to be reading everything off the slides. Uh, but this is information that's useful if you're deciding if a site is a good option for a Brightfield. So this is sort of the checklist that I would recommend going through before moving forward with any sort of exploration of the site. So first off, strategic reuse. You want to know, is there productive reuse of the site? Are there other potential reuses that could be more productive to the community? Is this the highest and best use of the site? Does it fit with the community vision? And then technically, does the site seem like it can reasonably support clean energy? What clean energy technologies could make sense, as different sites might be better suited for solar, wind, geothermal, or energy storage? Uh, is there any concern about shading, wetlands, or floodplains, or other things that would make it difficult to build? And then, is there an economically feasible pathway for how the electricity generated would be consumed? This could be a question that can get more in depth, as it might be, is there on-site use, or it might be something, a question that requires the utility involvement on if they'd be willing to interconnect to the grid. But all that to say is when you're trying to develop, there's a couple of key steps to consider and a sort of flow as you're considering these site checklist questions. So first off, you want to identify and pre-screen any sites. So that pre-screen would be sort of using that checklist and maybe not having clear answers, but just having some ideas of what the next questions you'd want to ask in terms of what would be needed to know to answer the questions on the checklist. Then, since you're going to want to answer those questions, it's a matter of identifying partners and stakeholders, engaging with the utility, and forming a team. This is going to be a combination of information gathering, looking at what's available as options, and sort of seeing what potential options exist for the site. Once you've determined the option that you think is worth considering, you can assess the funding and financing approaches that could support it. If everything pencils out, you're able to prepare for procurement. And that involves potentially meeting with developers to determine exactly what the site would need for development. Developers will give you proposals, which you'll evaluate. Then they'll construct it. And then finally, you'll have an active and operational brownfield to Brightfield site. So sort of broadly, the first few steps are planning. And then once the developer is involved, the implementation really begins and the site is developed into a Brightfield. It's rarely a linear journey. There's no cookie cutter approach that can serve every project or every community. So every question we provided is a guiding question. You'll know your community best, but I think we're trying to provide some broad ideas of what can work. But we can also provide more specific technical assistance on a site-by-site basis, which can include identifying your most promising Brightfield opportunities. This includes site screening, strategic reuse planning, and utility engagement. Funding and financing guidance, unpacking Brightfield's related incentives and funding strategy, assistance with brownfield grant applications, and accelerating Brightfield's procurement. So this can be figuring out what procurement support is needed and insights from Brightfield's market. And an important reminder is that this is technical assistance that RMI can provide for free, so no need to factor in us into your budget. Our job is to sort of use the funding we have to figure out what exactly your budget is and how stuff can support you in figuring out if a site is good. We also will tell you if we don't think a site is good, because not every brownfield site is going to be an easy developing win for Brightfields. And it's important not to press if it's not something that'll work, but a lot of them can be. So I think I'm going to pass it back to Matthew for the question and answer.
Thanks, Jacob. So yeah, we started today with the goal of explaining what, why, and how of Brightfields, and what's the opportunity and how to start. Hopefully, you have a sense of not only what are they and what do they look like, what are the benefits, why might you consider it, why might you not, and then also how to start a Brightfield project. And you're welcome to reach out to our team with the CCLR folks, with Claire, anytime, any stage of this journey to engage with us. We're going to shift in a moment to our Q&A and really office hours at this point. So people who want to drop off, this is in a moment. Please don't leave yet. But in a moment, that's when we'll get into more site-specific or community-specific questions. I see some chat about Alaska daylight hours and some sloping questions in the chat. And so those will be great specific ones to get into. And that's where we're headed. So with that, just wanted to highlight a couple of next steps here. So one, as I mentioned before, the slides and the recording will be shared by the end of the month. Um, the next part of this series will be on Thursday, August 13th at 10 a.m. Pacific time and 1 p.m. Eastern. That's where we'll dig more into the economics and financials. So you can start to think about in what markets, in what contexts, and in what situations does this make sense. We'll get into details there. We'll have a lot of time for questions in this, so we can really start to parse that out. Again, even if you're not a financial professional, this is going to be a great session for you to start to understand how to think about projects in different types of markets. So again, feel free to stick around for the next 30 minutes. At this point, we're going to throw up a final little reflection poll and survey just to get your feedback, particularly because we have a follow-up workshop. We want to know what worked well today, and we want to know what we can do better in the next workshop when we talk again to hopefully all of you and others on August 13th. And then with this, can we also throw the registration link into the chat so that folks who haven't registered but are here with us today can register for part two. Again, part two will not be a repeat of this. This will be a cumulative session where we'll build on what we talked about today and go much deeper into a few of the, particularly the economic and financial considerations. So you should see a poll on your screen. We welcome feedback of any depth you're willing to share. We do our best to adapt from every single session that we do so that we can make each one better than the last. And then I'll throw our contact information up on the screen. You can reach myself or Jacob there from RMI's team or Claire or Jean from the CCLR team with any questions about Brownfields, Brightfields, and the technical assistance available. Once you've submitted your reflections poll, if you are not interested in sticking around for office hours, feel free to drop off and have a wonderful rest of your day. If you do want to stick around, whether you have a question or not, you're welcome to listen in. It's going to be a free-for-all, no slides, just a conversation. We'll leave this up for those who are still writing. We'll keep that going, but I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to stop the recording now.